Scholar is a Bennettsville, South Carolina native, a former professor at Howard University, and author of the seminal work, The Destruction of Black Civilization. His name, Dr. Chancellor Williams. Taped in 1978, the film interview begins with this question. What role did religion play in the conquest of Africa?
Well, it played a key role because it came in with brotherhood. And the Africans believed in brotherhood. It came in one world idea, one great brotherhood. And of course, although there were some states that resisted this, saw through it for a long time. And for example, remember the Eternal Martyrs. You'd never forget them, because when you can't generalize for the continent, you see, because we're not talking about one nation, we're talking about a continent of people, you see. Have to keep that in mind every minute when you're talking about Africa, that you're talking about a continent. And we generally talk as though we're talking about one nation. We're talking about a continent made up of many nations. Okay, there were those who saw through the trick of religion as it was presented by both Islam and Christianity, and resisted both. The Martyr state was a great example of this. And there were others who resisted for a while, but eventually gave in because trade was a great attraction. Say, okay, you won't let us in? Well, can you let us trade around your borders here? And they established trading posts all around your borders, and gradually, you got in. But surely you let the Christians come in with they just want to preach to you about the same God that you believe in. Just want to show you there's one God over all.
But it was all trickery.
Found this one.
But it was all trickery.
Yes, it turned out to be nothing but trickery. Now, I would not say that this was a grand design of trickery. They just saw there was the traders were shrewd enough to see. The explorers, the conquerors, were shrewd enough to see that if they carried the missionaries in, they wouldn't have to go in fighting. Missionaries in trade as the first bait would make their pathway easier. I would call it, and have called it, the blacks' naivety, the blacks' gullibility, the blacks' over quest for brotherhood. For as I pointed out in a number of places, we were always the brotherhood seekers. We were always the brotherhood seekers. And this has been our main downfall. It's never the reverse. The whites only sought brotherhood or pretended brotherhood, or the Asians only pretended brotherhood. And when they saw an advantage of economic and political rule as the ultimate outcome.
Why is it that you always hear about European invasion of Africa, but very little about the Asian and the other groups that you mentioned?
Because the Europeans were the last. Colonialism is uppermost in our mind. Colonialism has just been, that is, political colonialism, I put it that way, has just been destroyed. Economic colonialism still persists in Africa. So the European hold on Africa was politically broken when they began to become free and set up their own government. However, as I also point out in my writing, that Africa is only half free, and I would hardly call it half free, when it's only politically free. It will not be free until it's economically free. So long as the economy is still under the control of foreigners, then its government is under the control of foreigners. It was unfortunate that blacks in the United States are still, like their African brothers, absorbed with the idea that politics is their salvation. Politics is not the salvation of the blacks. Politics is only one aspect. Without the other, you're nothing, and that is economic power. Economic power controls the politician. The politician acts and is controlled by the economic power of this nation, of any nation. That's where the power lies.
How did slavery come to be restricted to blacks?
Well, this is called a sort of lengthy explanation, but it is as brief as I can put it. The system was, for example, let's take the first widespread enslavers, the Arabs. They had a patrilineal system. Their offspring by black women belonged to the father. They were generally freed. Now, this is a very important point because it became a universal pattern. The freeing of the offspring of non-Africans by African women, whether they were Asian or European white, they were generally freed or given a highly preferential status in jobs, in education, and so forth and so forth. And slavery, after the great white slave rebellion, became, as is generally known, there was a time when everybody was enslaved. Slavery meant no more than political prisoners. I think that's generally known. To be a slave in the ancient world had no racial connotation at all, no racial significance at all. It just meant that whoever was victorious or had slaves. This was a pattern. And they knew very well that they were enslaving scholars and scientists and what have you. They knew that fact as they saw it out. The scholars and the scientists took care that they were not killed or hurt, because they wanted to use them in the home country. Okay, so slavery didn't carry any taint other than that would be carried by our present day POW, prisoners of war. That's all it was. But now a change took place after the white slave revolt. After the white slave revolt that murdered so many of the slave masters. Then slavery was discontinued among whites and concentrated upon the blacks. Thereafter, no white slavery among these other people died out. Now, since they were not enslaving those people who were of lighter hue by reason of their either Asian or Caucasian blood. They were concentrating on those with blacker skin. Therefore, not only was slavery limited to the blacks as a race, but it was limited to the blackest of the blacks, which is the reason why the word black itself became a symbol of bad luck, because they weren't going to bother you if you were light. You took a better chance of being free. You had a better chance of being free than if you were black. If you were black, you were subject to be seized. Therefore, it was bad luck to be black, and this is one of the reasons for that. So, in addition to the facts mentioned with respect to the enslavement of the blacks along color lines, I think it should be pointed out that the circumstances of conquest of the continent in which the invaders had the opportunity to make millions and millions of dollars in the slave trade, together with the exploitation of the mineral wealth of the continent, Also, together with the divisionism, they were able to perpetuate among the blacks in creating strife among the various language groups. All of this made the blacks easy prey to conquest. Finally, in addition to the other fact mentioned in connection with the previous discussion, our willingness to drive for brotherhood and our easy acceptance of the foreigner's hand and his expression of goodwill. So we became the victim of our own gullibility in a very, very real sense.
Specifically, how did Europeans and other groups go about wiping out the contributions of blacks? 2 or 3 things that you could mention.
Well, we've already mentioned the system of how this is done. They simply would take the achievements of the blacks and claim it as their own, or without mentioning the source of their new ideas or their what they call new, in quote, discovery or invention, things which they had removed. They simply would present it as their own creation.
In your book, you talked about how I think the Europeans, if I'm correct, would knock off the nose, the African features of statues. What about this whole thing?
Well, of course, there had been a system, a classical, what they call the classical style, over several thousand years of painting, where it was not regarded as proper to either carve, paint, or draw an individual as he really was. You used a form that you regarded as idealistic, a representation of him, which was not supposed to be the true representation. The true representation was always regarded as vulgar. And this was a practice, by the way, in Europe also for a long time, where they in any number of cases where they called that which was common, like the common language of a people, was regarded as vulgar. So you have to use something classical, like Latin, to be respectable. So it was in the drawing and such like things in Africa. Therefore, when Khufu had his picture, his actual statue in the Sphinx, carved in his true likeness, his true African likeness, broad nose, lips, and all. This was revolutionary because this wasn't done. He was supposed to, according to the classical tradition, he was supposed to have sharp nose, not a flat nose.
Once again, who is this?
Khufu. He was supposed to have a brownish type of skin and so forth and so on, features, or whatever it was the classical style for the period, and not the natural. Now, this shouldn't be shocking if you know the history of Europe or the history of other countries, what was classical and what was regarded as vulgar. But now we look at pictures of the Egyptian pictures now, or pictures of early Africans even. And they don't look like the actual Africans in many cases, except when they want to present them as slaves or something of that kind.
Okay. As you look at African history, do you see any parallels between that history and the condition of blacks